They called it a brotherhood. They called it a path to redemption. But the men who survived it called it something else entirely, hell on earth in uniform. Imagine stepping off a ship into North Africa in 1831, the sun so merciless it sears through bone, the air thick with rot and gunpowder. Within days, half the men beside you are either dead, deserting, or delirious with fever, and those still alive are forced to bury the fallen in shallow sand graves, sometimes before their bodies are even cold. These are not tales of military glory. They are the secret confessions of men who served in one of history's most infamous units, the French Foreign Legion of the 19th century. Their words, hidden in private diaries, last letters, and forgotten military files, reveal a world where survival replaced morality, where violence was ritualized, and where every man was expendable. Tonight, we open the archives of despair. This is not the story France wanted you to hear. This is the darkest confessions of the 19th century French Foreign Legion. The Foreign Legion wasn't created to uplift men, it was created to get rid of them. King Louis-Philippe signed the decree in 1831, and on paper, it sounded almost noble, a unit of foreign volunteers who would serve the interests of France overseas. But the truth was far grimmer. Paris was a city boiling over with political dissidents, failed revolutionaries, criminals on the run, and outcasts with nothing left. Rather than imprison them or risk them destabilizing the state, the government found a simpler solution: send them to die for the empire. Recruitment stations appeared in Europe's roughest districts. A man could walk in drunk, penniless, even under a false name, and walk out a legionnaire. Past crimes, erased. Broken life, irrelevant. The only requirement was a strong body and a willingness to sign away at least 5 years of existence. And so, men from across the continent poured in. German deserters fleeing the gallows, Italian radicals escaping the hangman, Spanish mercenaries chasing coin, and thieves who saw the Legion as their last chance before the prison gates closed forever. They did not march out as patriots. They marched out as the unwanted ghosts of Europe, exiled into French uniforms. The Legion's baptism of fire came in Algeria, a land France intended to conquer with brutal efficiency. But what awaited the legionnaires was not glory. It was disease, starvation, and an enemy that knew the terrain like a second skin. One young recruit wrote in a private letter that his company was dying faster than we could dig graves. Dysentery claimed dozens before they ever fired a shot. The heat drove men into madness. And when they did face Algerian resistance fighters, the locals fought with guerrilla tactics that shredded European lines. The French command quickly realized what the Legion was good for: suicide missions. Where regular French soldiers balked at the casualty rate, legionnaires were thrown in without hesitation. If half of them died, Paris would not mourn. They were, after all, the expendables. At the siege of Constantine in 1837, the Legion was placed at the most dangerous assault points. Prisoners were executed to save food. Wounded comrades who couldn't retreat were abandoned. Entire neighborhoods were set ablaze simply to deny shelter to defenders. One legionnaire later confessed to a chaplain, "We stopped being men. Hunger turned us into animals. Mercy was weakness. The wounded slowed us down. We left them. Prisoners became burdens. We shot them. By the end, I no longer cared who lived or died. Not even myself." This wasn't an isolated breakdown. It was the birth of Legion culture, a doctrine of survival at any cost. Life inside the Legion was as dangerous as battle itself. Officers were often disgraced men, commanders exiled from regular French regiments for drunkenness, insubordination, or scandal. They saw the Legion as punishment, and they treated their soldiers accordingly. Training wasn't about skill, it was about endurance. 20-hour marches, live-fire drills where recruits actually died, and punishments so severe they broke bones. A diary discovered decades later revealed the chilling philosophy: we were not trained to be soldiers, we were trained to endure hell. The Legion stripped men of their pasts. Upon enlistment, names were changed, identities erased. A German deserter might become a Frenchman overnight. A wanted criminal could vanish behind a new uniform. Speaking of past lives was forbidden. The message was clear. Your old self is dead. Only the Legion remains. This psychological rebirth created a twisted kind of brotherhood. With no ties to family, nation, or even personal identity, all that remained was loyalty to the man beside you and hatred for the enemy in front of you. But that loyalty had limits. In the Legion, even a brother could be abandoned if he slowed the unit down. Survival came first, morality last. If Algeria was a crucible, Spain was a grave. In 1835, the Legion was shipped to fight in the Carlist Wars, Spain's bloody civil conflict. France saw the Legion as the perfect disposable force, thousands of foreign mercenaries who could fight under the French flag without risking French public backlash. But the deployment was a disaster from the start. Supplies never arrived. Pay was withheld. Wounded men lay untreated for days. Legionnaires found themselves stealing food from the very civilians they were supposed to protect. One survivor's diary, found in a monastery, summed it up. We are phantoms, dying for reasons we do not understand. Abandoned by France, despised by Spain, cursed by the land itself. The Carlists gave no quarter, executing captured legionnaires on the spot. In response, the Legion adopted equally savage tactics, torturing prisoners for information, massacring entire villages suspected of aiding the enemy, and executing their own wounded rather than letting them fall into enemy hands. When France withdrew its support, the Legion was simply left behind. Of nearly 4,000 men sent into Spain, only a few hundred returned. The rest were dead, deserted, or swallowed by a country that wanted nothing to do with them. It was here that the Legion's men realized the full truth. France would use them, but France would not save them. By the 1880s, the Legion had already carved a reputation as the most brutal arm of the French military machine. But when they were shipped to Southeast Asia, they encountered an enemy unlike anything in North Africa or Spain. The jungles of Indochina swallowed men whole. Malaria, dysentery, and infections cut down soldiers faster than bullets. Entire companies rotted away before ever seeing the enemy. But when the Black Flag bands arrived, seasoned Chinese fighters hardened by the Taiping Rebellion, the Legion realized that this campaign would not just destroy bodies, it would break minds. The Black Flags were cunning, disciplined, and terrifyingly patient. They avoided direct confrontation. They mined roads, ambushed supply lines, and disappeared into the rainforest. To the legionnaires, the enemy seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once. One French officer admitted in a suppressed report, "We fought shadows. Every village might be a trap, every face a spy, every night a torment." For men already conditioned to abandon morality in Algeria and Spain, the jungles of Indochina pushed them to something even darker. The siege of Tuyenquang in 1885 became one of the most infamous episodes in Legion history. A garrison of fewer than 700 men, mostly legionnaires, was surrounded by thousands of Black Flag fighters. What followed was months of starvation, ceaseless attacks, and a new form of warfare, tunnels beneath the earth. The enemy dug beneath French fortifications, planting mines that tore entire sections of defenses apart. Legionnaires were forced to counter-dig, crawling through pitch-black passages where battles were fought with knives and bayonets in the dark. One soldier left a harrowing confession in his diary. "We fought standing on the bodies of friends. We killed by feel, not sight. When the lamps went out, the darkness was complete. I no longer knew if I struck the enemy or my own brother. It did not matter. The screams were the same." The psychological strain was unbearable. Some men shot themselves rather than risk being captured alive. Others claimed they could hear the voices of dead comrades whispering in the tunnels. When the siege finally ended, The survivors looked less like soldiers and more like walking corpses. They had won, technically, but the price of victory was their sanity. The Legion's response to the jungle war was as savage as the conditions that created it. Villages suspected of harboring Black Flag allies were burned to the ground. Civilians who could read or write French were executed on suspicion of being informants. Torture became not only a tool of interrogation, but a psychological ritual, a way for legionnaires to channel their own suffering onto others. A chaplain who later spoke out described what he had seen. They tortured not for knowledge, but for release. To inflict pain was to momentarily silence their own nightmares. Confessions written decades later confirm the same. Men kept trophies from their victims' ears, scalps, even bones tokens, not for military recognition, but for personal comfort. One private's effects, inventoried after his death from fever, included a pouch filled with human fingers. These were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were systemic, born of despair, and sanctioned by commanders who saw brutality as necessary for survival. By the late 19th century, vengeance was no longer just an instinct in the Legion, it had become a creed. Capture meant torture, so the Legion stopped taking prisoners. Wounded comrades were executed by their own brothers, rather than risk them falling into enemy hands. Mercy was a liability, compassion a weakness. One sergeant confessed before his execution, "We chose to kill our wounded, not in kindness, but in defiance. Better to die by a friend's hand than scream in an enemy's pit." We called it mercy, but it was pride. Pride twisted into murder. Officers who showed restraint were often removed from command. Those who displayed ruthless efficiency were promoted. The system rewarded savagery, ensuring that the most merciless rose in rank. Even faith was twisted. Chaplains who should have preached forgiveness instead sanctified violence. Surviving sermons in Legion archives revealed clergy who blessed acts of vengeance as though they were divine will. Mercy, they told the men, was the path of the weak. Thus was born what some veterans called the Brotherhood of Blood, an unspoken code binding legionnaires to avenge their fallen comrades at all costs. Orders could be ignored, civilians could be sacrificed, morality could be discarded, but vengeance had to be served. Over time, the Legion developed its own dialect, an argot filled with words that had no equivalent in civilian French. Dozens of terms described specific methods of killing, torturing, or disposing of bodies. Violence was not just a necessity, it became a language, a culture, a shared identity. Linguists who later studied this vocabulary found over 200 words related to cruelty alone. For legionnaires, to speak this language was to belong. To resist, it was to risk exile or death at the hands of one's own unit. One lieutenant wrote of a trial he presided over, where a soldier was accused of sparing Arab prisoners in Algeria. He was not judged for cowardice, but for weakness. The verdict was death, not because he failed the Legion, but because he betrayed the language we all spoke. The Legion had become more than an army. It had become a machine for stripping men of their humanity and remaking them into something else entirely. For those who survived their contracts, life after the Legion was often worse than death on the battlefield. Doctors reported men unable to sleep without nightmares, unable to live without violence. Families described husbands and fathers returning as strangers, incapable of tenderness or affection. Alcoholism, crime, and suicide plagued veterans who could no longer function in ordinary society. One widow wrote bitterly of her husband, who returned after 7 years in Africa. "The man who came back wore my husband's face, but his eyes were hollow, his hands shook, he spoke only of death. I could not touch him, for he recoiled as if I were his enemy." The Legion had promised redemption. Instead, it delivered exile first from their homelands and finally from their own humanity. When we peel back the official records and propaganda, what emerges are the voices of the damned legionnaires who could no longer carry the weight of what they had seen and done. These confessions, scribbled in journals, whispered to chaplains, or dictated on deathbeds, are some of the rawest accounts of human collapse ever recorded. One private, executed for murdering a comrade, left behind a letter to his estranged wife. "I am no longer the man you knew. The desert has burned away every trace of tenderness, every shred of hope. Love is something I can only remember, like a song half forgotten. I have become something else, something that survives, but no longer lives." Another diary, discovered in a trunk decades later, spoke with chilling detachment about daily atrocities. "Today we shot 6 prisoners who could no longer march. Their bodies fell quietly, like sacks of grain. I felt nothing. Once that emptiness terrified me. Now it feels natural, perhaps even necessary." These words are not from villains reveling in cruelty. They are the testimonies of broken men trying to make sense of the void left inside them. How did ordinary men become capable of such things? The answer lies not just in desperation, but in a system designed to erase humanity. From the first day of enlistment, the Legion forced recruits to shed their past identities. Names were changed, histories buried. A man who had once been a farmer in Bavaria or a student in Milan was told to forget he ever lived outside the Legion's walls. Training wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Hazing rituals forced new recruits to take part in executions or desecrations, making them complicit in acts they could never undo. Once your hands were bloodied, there was no turning back. One testimony explained it bluntly. "They made us kill at the beginning so that we could never again pretend we were innocent. Once you had crossed that line, you belonged to the Legion forever." Collective punishment reinforced this conditioning. If one man disobeyed or showed mercy, the entire unit suffered through starvation, forced marches, or suicidal missions. Peer pressure did the rest. Compassion wasn't just dangerous, it was a betrayal of every man beside you. In this way, brutality was not an accident, it was engineered. Over time, killing became more than survival, it became ritual. Legionnaires developed ceremonies around death, executing wounded comrades with words of grim blessing, turning torture into acts of symbolic revenge, collecting tokens from the dead as if they were relics. One chaplain described it with horror. They had transformed violence into a form of worship. Where others prayed for forgiveness, they prayed for vengeance. Legion slang reflected this ritualization. Soldiers invented hundreds of words for methods of killing, each with its own nuance, like artisans naming their tools. To speak this language was to show belonging. To reject it was to risk ostracism or execution by one's own brothers. Even religion was twisted. Sermons in some Legion units replaced compassion with bloodlust. One priest's writings, preserved only because they were so shocking, preached, "The enemy is not your fellow man. He is the obstacle to God's will. His destruction is not murder, but holy necessity." In this warped theology, brutality was sanctified, and men who once might have prayed for salvation now prayed for the strength to kill again. Eventually, even the military hierarchy itself began to break down. When officers faltered, mutinies erupted. Soldiers no longer obeyed orders for the sake of rank, they obeyed only when those orders aligned with their own code of survival. Some units became self-governing bands of killers, bound not by military law, but by the brotherhood of blood, a vow to avenge comrades regardless of orders or politics. One lieutenant described the day discipline vanished. The captain shouted, but no one listened. We looked at him and saw a man as lost as ourselves. Rank meant nothing when death stalked us all equally. From that day, the Legion was ruled not by officers, but by necessity. The French state had unleashed a weapon it could barely control, a mercenary force that answered first to survival and second to revenge. For those who somehow survived their contracts, the war never ended. Doctors documented men plagued by uncontrollable rage, paranoia, and hallucinations. Some believed they were still under attack years after leaving the Legion. Others became violent criminals or alcoholics, unable to exist without conflict. One physician wrote of his patients, "They did not return as men, but as shadows. They could wear civilian clothes, but their minds remained on the battlefield. Peace was unbearable to them. Families bore the scars too. Children grew up with fathers who could not love, who mistook tenderness for weakness, who repeated the legion's cycle of cruelty at home. Wives wrote of men who came back strangers, husbands in name only, incapable of affection. One widow captured the tragedy in a single line. "The legion gave him back to me alive, but not human." Perhaps the most haunting confession of all came from a soldier who admitted he could not live without brutality. "The legion made me need violence the way other men need bread. Without it, I starve. In peace, I rot. Only in battle do I feel whole again." This was the final transformation. Men who no longer saw violence as duty or survival, but as the only thing that gave life meaning. For some, the legion became not a punishment, but an addiction. They re-enlisted again and again, incapable of imagining life outside the crucible of death. Others sought out brawls, crimes, or mercenary work simply to feed the hunger that the legion had planted in their veins. The cycle was complete. The legion had created not soldiers, but men for whom peace itself was the enemy. The brutality of the legion was not simply the product of desperate men, it was the result of deliberate design. Step by step, the legion became a machine engineered to turn out killers. New recruits were broken down from the start. Upon enlistment, men were stripped of names, languages, and identities. A German deserter could become Pierre. An Italian radical might vanish behind the name Jean. It wasn't a choice, it was a ritual burial of the past. The Legion wasn't just a military unit. It was a graveyard of identities. One testimony recalled the moment vividly. "They told me, 'Your name is dead. Forget the man you were. From this moment, you belong only to the Legion.' I felt as if I had been executed without a bullet." This erasure wasn't about efficiency, it was about control. A man without a past had nothing left to cling to. His only loyalty became the Legion itself. The first months of service were a descent into ritualized cruelty. Recruits weren't just trained, they were baptized in blood. Older legionnaires forced newcomers to participate in acts of violence, sometimes against deserters, sometimes against prisoners, sometimes even against civilians unlucky enough to be caught. One recruit confessed years later, "They made me strike a prisoner with my own hands. I didn't want to, but they told me, 'If you don't, you're next.' So I struck. In that moment, my innocence ended." This initiation created a permanent bond of guilt. No legionnaire could claim moral purity once he had crossed that line. They were all complicit, all equally damned. And because they had sinned together, they belonged together. The Legion also used fear as glue. If one man faltered, showed weakness, refused an order, or spared an enemy, the punishment fell on everyone. Whole companies were denied food, marched until collapse, or sent on impossible missions as punishment for one man's disobedience. The message was simple: your survival depends on your brother's ruthlessness. One sergeant wrote bitterly, "Mercy was more dangerous than bullets. If one man spared a prisoner, we all suffered. Compassion could kill more men than cannon fire." The result was a culture where cruelty wasn't just tolerated, it was demanded. Weakness endangered everyone. Brutality kept you alive. Even official duty rosters reveal how violence was institutionalized. Surviving archives show rotations where soldiers were systematically assigned to executions, torture sessions, and punitive raids. Every man was required to blood his hands. No one was allowed to remain clean. Officers believed this eliminated hesitation and ensured that no soldier could claim moral superiority over another. A chilling letter from a captain to his superiors stated, "All men must kill, so that none may question the necessity of killing." Violence wasn't just an option, it was a scheduled duty, like guard shifts or latrine cleaning. The Legion's secret dialect, the argot, developed in its ranks, reflected this institutional obsession with brutality. Words were invented for every imaginable act, different verbs for strangling, shooting, stabbing, or abandoning the wounded. The vocabulary didn't just describe violence, it normalized it, even celebrated it. For example, sparing an enemy had its own derogatory term, a word that meant both coward and traitor. Meanwhile, executions were described in slang that carried undertones of professionalism, as if they were acts of craftsmanship. Language itself became a weapon, ensuring that recruits absorbed the culture of cruelty through every casual conversation. Even the legion's courts were corrupted by this machinery. When a soldier was put on trial for killing civilians or disobeying orders, the proceedings rarely sought justice. Instead, they reinforced the culture of violence. Testimonies against the accused were dismissed if the victims were unworthy, which often meant local civilians or prisoners. One lieutenant described presiding over such a case. The man was guilty, yes, but guilty of killing Arabs, and so the court found him innocent. The Legion had abandoned not just civilian morality, but even military law. What remained was a legal system where violence was absolution, and restraint was the only true crime. Even the medical corps was reshaped to serve the machine. Doctors did not focus on healing in the traditional sense. Their job was to keep men alive long enough to continue fighting, no matter the mental or moral cost. Reports from military physicians described treatments that dulled trauma without curing it, pumping men with stimulants or alcohol so they could return to the battlefield. One doctor admitted in his notes, "We do not treat to heal, we treat to preserve usefulness. The mind remains broken, but the body continues to kill." By doing so, the Legion created soldiers who were physically functional but psychologically ruined men who could endure battle, but could never again live in peace. Back in France, the truth of the Legion's brutality was buried beneath layers of propaganda. Newspapers published stories of gallant foreign volunteers bringing civilization to distant lands. Paintings showed legionnaires as heroes, not executioners. At the same time, military censors suppressed reports of atrocities and silenced survivors who spoke too openly. A surviving letter between a colonel and a Parisian editor reveals the deliberate cover-up. Emphasize courage, omit cruelty. The public must see sacrifice, not savagery. Our empire depends on it. The Legion's darkness was hidden, its sins buried. But in the margins, in forgotten letters, censored reports, and hidden diaries, the truth endured. The machinery of cruelty achieved its purpose. It produced soldiers capable of fighting in the Empire's harshest wars, but it also produced men who could never again rejoin ordinary life. When they left the Legion, they carried the machine with them in their scars, in their nightmares, in their craving for violence. Some became mercenaries, unable to function without conflict. Others sank into crime or madness. Many simply re-enlisted, preferring the hell they knew to the emptiness of civilian life. A veteran summarized it best in his dying words. "The Legion is not a chapter in a man's life, it is his ending. Once you have belonged to it, nothing else remains." The Legion was built on desperation, but desperation was profitable. Unlike regular French troops, who earned pensions and recognition, legionnaires received the bare minimum. Their pay barely covered rations. Equipment, uniforms, and medical treatment were often charged against their wages, plunging many into perpetual debt. One private's financial records show the cruel arithmetic. 7 years of service in Algeria and Indochina left him owing more to the army than he had ever been paid. He had risked his life countless times, but the balance sheet declared him a debtor, not a veteran. The system ensured that soldiers remained bound to the Legion. Discharge offered no safety net, no compensation, no future. For many, re-enlistment wasn't loyalty, it was survival. A soldier could either return to a Europe that had discarded him, penniless and broken, or remain in the Legion's embrace, where at least violence gave him purpose. The Legion had turned human misery into a revolving economy. Take in the desperate, consume their bodies, discard or recycle what was left. Even those who left the Legion alive often found themselves in a limbo worse than death. Returning home was almost impossible. Many had enlisted under false names, making reintegration legally difficult. Others were fugitives who dared not return to their homelands. And even for those who could go back, the stigma was crushing. Civilian authorities viewed former legionnaires with suspicion. Families saw them as strangers. Communities whispered that they were dangerous, tainted by the horrors they had endured. One veteran wrote bitterly from Marseille, "We are ghosts haunting the edges of the society we once served. Too dangerous to trust, too damaged to love, too broken to employ." The Legion had given them a uniform, but stolen their place in the world. For many, the Legion also destroyed the last refuge of faith. Raised in Catholic Europe, these men carried into battle a belief in divine justice. But the Legion's endless cruelties mocked those convictions. Priests who should have offered comfort often justified vengeance. Atrocities were committed with blessings. Some legionnaires renounced faith entirely. Others twisted religion into something unrecognizable. One sergeant, once a seminary student, wrote in despair, "If God exists, He has abandoned us. Perhaps He delights in our suffering. Perhaps the Legion is His punishment. If so, then hell is not below us, it marches with us." For these men, the loss of faith was not intellectual, it was visceral. To survive was to abandon the idea of a benevolent God. To fight was to accept a universe ruled only by cruelty. The Legion's shadow didn't end with the soldiers. It reached into the homes of those who waited for them. Letters from wives and families reveal the devastation. Men returned as strangers, silent, violent, incapable of affection. Some refused to be touched, others reacted to tenderness with rage. One widow's words remain unforgettable. "The man who came back bore my husband's face, but not his soul. He recoiled from our children. He spoke only of death. At night, he screamed as though he was still in battle. We lived with a ghost until the day his body followed his soul." The Legion had promised transformation. It delivered possession men returned physically, but inhabited by something dark that families could not recognize. The children of these men carried scars they had never earned. Accounts from social workers in the early 20th century describe families where the father's trauma poisoned the household. Sons grew up under violent discipline. Daughters lived in fear of unpredictable outbursts. Many children inherited not only emotional wounds, but also their father's sense of exile, outsiders in their own communities. Some veterans passed their nightmares directly into their children, not through words, but through silence. Unspoken traumas became legacies of fear, shaping lives for generations. The Legion had not only consumed the men who served it, had seeded despair in their descendants. The 19th century Legion did not exist in isolation. Its methods, erasure of identity, ritualized brutality, collective punishment, would later echo in darker chapters of history. Colonial armies studied its tactics. Totalitarian regimes admired its ability to strip men of individuality and remake them into tools of violence. In its obsession with control and cruelty, the Legion offered a blueprint for transforming ordinary men into instruments of atrocity. One historian, reviewing classified manuals decades later, wrote, "The Legion demonstrated how far a state can go in weaponizing human desperation. What was learned on the battlefields of Algeria and Indochina would be repeated on a far greater scale in the wars of the 20th century. The Legion was not merely a product of its time, it was a warning unheeded. The final cruelty of the Legion was that its darkest confessions remained hidden for so long. Official histories spoke of honor and discipline. Public monuments praised sacrifice. The true testimonies of men who shot their own wounded, who tortured prisoners, who abandoned all faith, were locked away in archives or buried in private papers. Only in the late 20th century did these voices begin to emerge. By then, the men themselves were long gone, their stories whispered across generations until they became fragments of memory. Yet even in silence, the price was clear. The Legion devoured tens of thousands of lives, not just in battle, but in homes, in churches, in the psyches of families. It created men who could never return, children who inherited ghosts, and societies that preferred to forget the cost of empire. Surviving the Legion was no triumph, it was a sentence. Many who lived through their 5-year contracts discovered that the price of survival was the death of something far deeper than the body. Compassion, faith, innocence, all had been stripped away. What remained was a hollowed-out shell of a man, animated by habit, bound together by scars. One veteran, interviewed decades after his service, said quietly, "We survived, yes, but what survived was not human. It was something else, something colder, harder, emptier. I would rather have died in Algeria than come home as what I became." The Legion's true weapon was not the rifle or the bayonet. It was this transformation, the turning of men into beings who could endure anything, because they no longer felt anything. Some of the most chilling confessions were spoken in the final hours of dying legionnaires. A private named Kerner, awaiting execution for murdering a fellow soldier, wrote to his estranged wife, "I once knew love, I once knew tenderness, but those things have been burned away. The Legion made me into a creature fit only for killing. If you remember me, remember not the man I am now, but the boy I was before." Another, delirious from fever in Indochina, scribbled, "Evil is not the absence of good. Evil is the weight of necessity. We killed because survival demanded it, and so necessity has made devils of us all." These words were never meant for history books. They were whispered into the darkness, scratched on scraps of paper, entrusted to priests who often hid them away. But together, they reveal the terrible truth. The Legion did not break men, it remade them. Even after leaving the Legion, many veterans never escaped it. Doctors who studied them in French port cities recorded cases of violent outbursts, nightmares so vivid that men awoke with bloodied hands from clawing at their own skin, and delusions that enemies were still hunting them years after the wars had ended. One physician described them as souls permanently scorched, who can live neither in war nor in peace. A wife recalled how her husband, a veteran of Algeria, would wake screaming every night, shouting the names of comrades long dead. By day he was silent, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Eventually, he hanged himself in their barn. She found him swinging like a ghost who had chosen his own gallows. The Legion had given these men survival, but only survival. Life itself, in any meaningful sense, was gone. One of the most disturbing cultural legacies of the Legion was its obsession with vengeance. When comrades were killed, survivors swore oaths of retribution. These vows often outlived the wars themselves. Veterans spoke of dreams in which fallen brothers appeared, demanding blood long after the battles were over. A priest who ministered to them wrote, "They live in a religion of vengeance. God is absent, Christ is silent, but vengeance speaks louder than prayer. It becomes their sacrament, their absolution, their reason for being." In this twisted brotherhood, mercy was betrayal, and vengeance was the highest loyalty. It bound them together, but it also bound them to endless violence, even when no enemy remained. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Legion had already become legend. Paintings, novels, and propaganda celebrated its endurance and mystique. Young men across Europe dreamed of joining its ranks. But beneath the legend lay the shadow, the hidden archive of confessions, letters, and diaries that told a different story. A story of starvation, torture, abandonment, and moral collapse. The public saw marching columns in white kepis. They did not see the suicides, the nightmares, the wives widowed in spirit long before, in fact. They saw an empire expanding. They did not see the graves dug by fever, or the bones of men left behind in deserts and jungles. The Legion's true history was not written in medals. It was written in wounds. The most haunting aspect of these confessions is how familiar they sound today. The mechanisms of brutality, the erasure of identity, the ritual of hazing, the culture of vengeance did not vanish with the 19th century. They resurfaced in colonial wars, in concentration camps, in modern armies that pushed men beyond the boundaries of conscience. The Legion was not just a French story, it was a human one. A story of how easily civilization can be stripped away, how quickly men can become instruments of cruelty when survival demands it. As one historian put it, the Legion's greatest lesson is not about France or empire, it is about us. It shows how thin the skin of civilization truly is. Perhaps the darkest confession comes not from a soldier, but from the institution itself. The Legion was designed to take in the unwanted, the desperate, the broken, and to turn them into expendable tools of empire. And it succeeded. Its very structure was a confession that some lives could be consumed so that others might expand their borders, secure their power, or protect their pride. Every grave in Algeria, every fever-stricken corpse in Indochina, every ruined family in Europe was part of that confession. The Legion admitted, without ever saying it aloud, that empires are not built on glory, they are built on human wreckage. Today, the French Foreign Legion still exists, transformed, modernized, no longer the beast it was in the 19th century, yet its past lingers in the shadows of history. The testimonies of those damned men letters never meant to be read, confessions scrawled in fever, diaries hidden away still whisper to us. They remind us that beneath the uniforms, beneath the banners of empire, war is always the same, the breaking of men until nothing remains but survival. And survival, as the Legion proved, can sometimes be the darkest fate of all.